Bob did everything society told him to do. Study hard, get good grades, get a degree. That was the formula. At least, that's what everyone said. Teachers said it, parents said it, and Professor Fat Cat repeated it in every lecture. Education is the greatest investment you can make. Professor Fat Cat looked like a man who knew what he was talking about. Fancy suit, big office, walls covered with certificates, and a bookshelf full of very expensive textbooks. Bob believed him. So Bob followed the system perfectly. He attended every lecture, he highlighted every textbook page. He stayed awake at night preparing for exams, and it worked. Bob passed his classes, collected good grades, moved forward, semester after semester, but something strange started happening. The more Bob studied, the less he understood how the real world worked, and he wasn't alone. Most students around him weren't learning how to solve problems. They were learning something else: how to pass exams, memorize information, write it on the answer sheet, and forget it a week later. Bob started noticing a strange rule. The system didn't reward understanding, it rewarded memorization. If you remembered the correct answer during the exam, you passed. If you didn't, you failed. Whether you truly understood the topic, that often didn't matter. But Professor Fat Cat didn't seem worried. In fact, he seemed to be doing very well. Every semester something new appeared. New course fees, new mandatory materials, and of course, a brand new textbook edition. Bob bought the latest version. It cost $120. Later, he compared it with the previous edition. Almost everything was identical. A few sentences changed, a few pictures moved, but the price? Much higher. That's when Bob discovered something interesting. Academic publishing is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Textbooks are updated constantly, not always because knowledge changed, but because new editions force students to buy the book again. Professor Fat Cat called it academic progress. Bob started calling it something else. Then he noticed another pattern. Students were graduating with degrees, but companies kept saying the same thing. Graduates lack real-world skills. Why? Because the system often focuses on theory instead of practice. Think about it. In most classes, success means pass the exam, submit the assignment, collect the grade. Once the semester ends, most of that knowledge disappears. It's almost like the brain already knows the rule. This information is temporary. Meanwhile, Professor Fat Cat stood confidently at the front of the classroom. Education is priceless, he said proudly. Which was interesting, because Bob checked his tuition bill, and it definitely had a price, a very large one. Slowly, Bob started seeing the bigger picture. Universities kept expanding. More courses, more students, more fees. The system grew larger every year, and like many large systems, it didn't change very quickly, even though the world outside was changing fast. One evening, Bob stayed late after class. The campus was almost empty. As he walked down the hallway, he passed Professor Fat Cat's office. The door was slightly open. Inside, the professor was on the phone. Yes, increase the tuition next year, and make that course mandatory. Bob stood there quietly. Suddenly, everything made a little more sense. Education wasn't just about knowledge anymore, it was also a business. And businesses have one main goal: growth. The next day in class, Professor Fat Cat smiled at the students. Remember, he said, education is the key to success. Bob slowly raised his hand. Yes, Bob? The professor asked. Bob thought for a moment. Then he asked a question that made the entire room silent. Professor, are we here to learn, or are we part of the system that sells learning? Professor Fat Cat adjusted his tie. He smiled, a very calm smile. Well, Bob, he said, sometimes those two things look very similar. Bob didn't argue, but for the first time, he understood something important. Learning wasn't the problem. Learning is powerful. The problem was confusing education with learning. Education is a system, but learning is something much simpler. It happens when you try to solve real problems, when you build things, when you experiment, when you fail, and none of that requires permission from a syllabus. That night, Bob went home. He opened a book again, but this time, he wasn't studying for an exam. He was studying because he was curious, and something strange happened. For the first time, the information actually stayed in his mind, because curiosity remembers what obligation forgets. Meanwhile, Professor Fat Cat prepared next semester's lecture. He walked into the empty classroom and said confidently, education is the greatest investment you can make. But somewhere outside that system, Bob quietly wrote down a different rule, a rule no institution could sell. Never outsource your curiosity.